The storm crawled up the stone like a living thing, finding every seam in seam's memory. It sent its long sheathed claws into mortar and dragon carving, ran salt over the mouths of gargoyles, and made the sea beat itself hoarse against Dragonstone's ragged teeth. The halls smelled of damp ash and old oil. In the tower of the sea dragon, the corridors narrowed to the width of a man's shoulders. Lanterns hissed and guttered, and a child's ragged cry dared the thunder. Stannis Baratheon stopped just short of the doorway. His boots left a grim dark shining on the flags, rain mapping his progress from quarried stair to high passage, as if the castle wished to mark his trespass and grudge it. His hair had been plastered to his skull, and had since dried into a stubborn thatch. The salt had crusted a white rime at the edges of his black cloak, and along the stubble of his jaw. On the threshold, the steward bowed too hastily and backed away, the old man's hands jerking as if drawn by strings. The chamber beyond stank of blood and boiled rags. "The queen is dead, my lord," the maester murmured, appearing like a heron from a rush bed, tall and colorless, with a length of linen clenched in both hands. "In childbed, as we feared. The babe lives," a woman said from the far side of the bed. Her voice was dry but certain, as a hearth that has learned how to keep itself. The midwife's sleeves were rolled to the elbow. The cords in her forearms leapt and settled with each motion. She carried a swaddled bundle against her chest, and the bundle squirmed and found its own voice, smaller than thunder but more stubborn. Stannis stepped in, past the queen's sheeted face and the purpled knuckles slack upon the coverlet. Rhaella Targaryen, last lawful wife of Aerys, had in death the peace that had fled her living. She looked old, and she had not been old, not by years. Her hair was gray at the temples, her cheeks hollowed by a rain run on fear. Some of the fear still clung to the rushes and to the canopy and to the empty chair by the brazier. The chamber did not know yet that she was beyond it, and showed its ignorance by trembling. "Viserys," Stannis said. The maester gestured toward the inner room. "There, my lord." He would not keep away. "I had to send the boy's nurse to the kitchens to quiet him long enough for us to do what was needed." "Needed," Stannis repeated. A piece of the storm was still inside his chest. It creaked the way old hulls creak when swell lifts them in darkness. He shook water from his cloak, and it tapped the flags like tossed small stones. The child's face peered from the cloth with a furious squint, as if this life had already offended her, and she would set her account down at once. A girl. A daughter. The midwife had the cautious pride of a soldier presenting a victory to a lord he does not trust. Strong lungs. The babe's cry broke and caught, and she groped with a starfish hand at the ragged edge of the blanket, and found nothing and wailed again. Stannis smelled milk soured by fear, and the iron coin of blood. He had never been at a birthing before. His people came out of women as kings came out of storm, reported, not witnessed. He felt the clumsiness of his hands as if they had been newly attached, and did not reach for the child. "You could have put them in a boat and slipped them out before we made the inner jetty," came a voice from behind and to the side, roughened by salt and long nights, with a touch of the sea's grin in it. "But the gods saw fit to wait for us, it seems." Davos Seaworth stood in the doorway, dripping his own rain onto the flagstones. He still wore his smuggler's clothes, though he wore them like a man expecting to pay for them. In the passage beyond, 3 golden black men of Storm's End kept back the watch with their looks. Stannis neither smiled at Davos, nor ordered him away. He had called for the man because he trusted 2 things about him: that Davos would come, and that he would tell him the truth unadorned. "They were trapped," Stannis said. "The fleet's at anchor in every cove from Broad Arch to Tarth. The garrison surrendered the east gate by morning. There was nowhere to go." "Save the open sea," Davos answered. The ghost of the old life clung to him the way salt clung to rope, which kills half the men who love it and all the men who don't, when a storm like that takes the notion. Any shipmaster with less than 7 gods at his shoulders would have told the queen as much. No. She is past gods," the maester said more sharply than he had intended. He carried his plain grief like a stick that might become a weapon. "We will name the babe Daenerys, as her mother wished." She said it as she was going. Stannis stared at the shrouded figure on the bed. "Daenerys dot." The name came off his tongue oddly. Names were not his work. Oaths were, and commands. He could not see Aerys in the small wrinkled face peering out of the swaddling. Only stubbornness, a kind he knew by heart. He had been prepared for a boy, and had been prepared for blood. He had told himself 20 times up the spiral stairs that he would do what the law demanded, and the safety of the realm required. He had told himself that he would hand a prince to his brother with his own hands, and bear whatever came of it without complaint. But this was not a prince. This was a daughter with purpled eyelids and a voice like a knife dragged over slate. "Viserys," Stannis said again, and went into the inner room before the storm in his bones could change shape again. The boy had hidden himself under the table, and given himself away by ferreting through the dyed tassels of the carpet with quick white hands. He had the silver hair of his house and the thin wrists of a child who had grown up in a keep that kept its bread for men with spears. When Stannis ducked under the table, the boy pulled his knees up to his chin and made a hard white oval of himself and glared. His eyes were hunting hawk purple. Some men called those eyes the sign of dragons. Stannis had never seen a dragon outside a book, and had killed the last of the men who wore them like armor. "Come out," Stannis said. "Stand on your feet." "No." The boy's voice was a small clean blade, the sort that pieces of sausage do not notice until they see their own blood. Stannis held his own temper as one holds the heavy end of a lever with both hands. The boy had one weapon left, and it was refusal. Taking it from him would be theft, not victory. "Your sister cries," he said instead. "If you wish to hear her, you cannot hear her from under the table." The boy's chin trembled before it reasserted its pride. "Why would I? Your men killed my uncles." "All men in armor killed all other men in armor for a year," Stannis replied. "Speak sense, boy." "My mother said you were iron," the boy whispered. He was not so foolish as he pretended. He watched Stannis face the way a mouse watches the stoop of a hawk. "She said iron sinks and does not float, and that iron keeps its shape." "My brother is king," Stannis said. "Iron and all, he will say what is to be done. Until then, I do what is right for him and his realm." He thought of what Robert would want. The thought had had one shape for so long, vengeance, and had lately taken on another, thinner and more troublesome: peace. "Come out." Viserys slid like a fish from under the table and stood. He tried to make his shoulders wide and his wrists invisible. When Stannis held out his hand, the boy did not take it. He stood and made his face a mask older than his bones. He walked back through the birthing chamber with the boy beside him and Davos behind. The midwife had vanished into the lower world of water and cloth. The maester had covered the queen's face. The babe was in a wicker basket near the brazier, for warmth. She slept as if she had invented the trick. Viserys stopped and stared at her and swallowed. A boy trying to swallow a city and a sea and his mother's last word. "What will you do with us?" he asked Stannis. "Carry you to the king," Stannis said. "And then it will be done as law says it should be done. We are not pirates. This is not a raid. You will kill us," Viserys said, as if he were telling Stannis that the rain was wet and the sea was salt. "We will keep the peace," Stannis said. The boy's mouth went hard. He looked at the bundle in the basket, and then at the door, and then at Stannis, and measured his chances. He was not a fool, not entirely. He let himself be led. On the steps down, the storm tested the windows and found some wanting. The corridor slicked with tears from the cracks. The great hall of Dragonstone, black ribs, black tables, dragon mouths along the beams, smelled of men who had slept there in their armor and prayed there with their eyes open. Stannis walked past them with the Targaryen boy at his hip, and the Targaryen girl in the arms of a Storm's End man with a careful face. When the wind came through the doors, it brought a noise like a crowd too far away to see. Dragons, the small folk would whisper later, had wept in their sleep. What Stannis heard was a kingdom shifting its weight. They took ship with the tide. It was still dark enough to pretend that night had not ended. Stannis stood on the foredeck and watched Dragonstone become a silhouette, then a thought, then something he had never loved and had never been meant to love. Davos kept below with the children because he had the sense the gods give men who intend to live, and because Viserys would not let any of Stannis' knights come near him with the babe. The boy had squared his shoulders and set himself to the work of being a brother. And when the babe in the basket loosed herself upon the air with those new lungs, he put a hand on the blanket as if that would quiet a storm. King's Landing met them as if it were a mouth the world had made in mischief. The smell came first, the stew of tanneries and tar and spilled wine, the latrines that forgot their manners at noon, the river mud that remembered everything and did not forgive. The Red Keep sat like a clenched fist above it all. The bells were uncertain. Some of the septs had had their clappers stolen in the famine of the war year, and their uncertainty spread like ripples. People left their work and stood on wharves and rooftops, on the walls of warehouses and the backs of carts, to see the Targaryen children come home. In the river barges, cabin Viserys had fallen asleep at last, his hand still in the basket. Davos, eyes half-lidded, watched the door as if he expected the sea to open it. The babe had more patience than any of them. She had made small fists and was quiet, as if she understood a bargain and intended to keep it until there was advantage to break it. When the barge nosed the royal jetty, Davos rose. He had a smuggler's posture off him at last. He lifted the basket with the same care he had used on boxes of onions and casks of wine, because care was care whatever it held. King Robert had chosen to meet them himself. The decision had been Jon Arryn's, of course. The old falcon kept his counsel, asked for nothing twice, and then somehow men did as he'd wished and remembered afterward that they had wanted to. Robert stood in plain mail with a leather surcoat and no crown, because he had learned as a boy that crowns made a poor helmet, and as a man that they made a better target. He had a gilt-hilted sword on his hip and a weariness under his eyes that no sleep would mend. Behind him the court arranged itself into lines of loyalty and curiosity. Pycelle with his heavy chain and heavier breath. Varys like a plump shadow. Sir Barristan Selmy in white, oh so white, as if he had been laundered by the gods. Jaime Lannister the golden with his golden scorn. Cersei with a veil and a look trained into sweetness until it cut you. Renly still growing into his limbs. A cluster of lesser men who would... Stannis came down the gangplank, as if it were one more tedious stair in a castle that could not stop thrusting stairs underfoot. He saluted his brother because the realm needed example as much as it needed laws. The boy Viserys came behind, unsteady on the unfamiliar planks, but refusing any hand. Davos followed with the basket. Robert's face showed the storm that had rent him 3 times. When Lyanna died, when he learned Rhaegar's children had died, when he had consented to wearing a crown. It showed too the labor Jon Arryn had done in him these last months. His mouth might have shaped a curse. He caught it in time and turned it into a breath that moved his chest and came out unsettled. "Brother," he said to Stannis. He did not embrace him. They had not been boys for too long. "You have done as asked." "I do as the king commands," Stannis said. He did not look at Cersei when he said it, and so did not see the way her lips tensed as if something sour had been put upon her tongue. Viserys Targaryen stared at the man who was the reason he had a brother's duty instead of a father's house, and found that he had nowhere safe to hold his eyes. Robert Baratheon was too large and too alive, and too much like the songs had said, only blurrier round the edges. The boy stood and thought the things a boy thinks when he has no sword to hide behind. That his hair is poor armor, that his name weighs more in his throat than it does in his hand, that the floor is too sure to run and too coarse to kneel upon. "This is Viserys of House Targaryen," Stannis said, because names needed speaking. "And the child Daenerys, born as we took the Isle. The Queen Rhaella is dead." "Man?" There was a silence in which it was possible to hear the river think about going out to sea. Then Jon Arryn took a step forward so that his voice would be the first that did not belong to a brother. "Your Grace," he said, "I have counseled mercy." Robert's mouth twitched. "The realm has had a bellyful of my mercy," he said. "Mercy kills men as quickly as iron if you measure by the long way of it. It also ends wars," Jon Arryn said. His hands were folded over one another, as if to keep them from fidgeting with the invisible strings that bound the kingdom. "Viserys is a boy. The babe knows only milk. The crown has the strength to be seen, and the realm has the hunger to be fed. If your grace declares these children royal wards, fostered under your protection, it will tell every lord who waits with a foot on his stirrup that the war is truly ended, and will not start itself again with new excuses." "Word," Robert repeated, making a fist of the word and opening it again. He looked at Barristan without meaning to. The White Knight's face did not move. He looked at Jaime and saw a boy carved in Lannister gold, who would never forgive anything that did not serve him. He looked at Varys and saw a question mark fattened by honey. He looked at Cersei and saw his marriage as if it were someone else's cloak, fur-lined and beautifully cut, and always a little too tight across the chest. He looked at Stannis and saw a law given a face that had never learned how to smile. He looked at Jon Arryn and saw a hand held out not to be shaken, but to be followed into balance. He looked last at the basket Davos held, at the small face within, and saw nothing of Rhaegar and everything of the world's indifference to the shape of old grief. He had broken men like kindling with his hammer. He had put the last Targaryen prince down into the river with men crying around him. His dreams still woke him with Lyanna's smell, arbor leaves crushed green horse snow, and with her voice saying, "Promise me," though promise what he could never say aloud. He had promised her something. He had promised himself something. He could break them both and the realm with them, or he could bend one. "Word," he said again. He put his fist out and made it gentle instead of hard, and touched the basket's edge with the back of 2 knuckles. As if the child were a stubborn hound he did not wish to startle. "Word. I, realm's ward, under my protection." The boy too. He dug in his chest and found a laugh that did not taste of wine. "He looks at me as if he would set the crown on my head and then yank it off by the roots." Viserys did not answer because he had learned enough in a night to know when not to. Davos let out a breath he hadn't noticed he'd tied into a knot. Jon Arryn nodded once. It was the proudest nod a man could make without showing his teeth. Varys' hands made small cloudy shapes in the air, like doves that have forgotten they are doves. Cersei's smile put away its sweetness and kept only its practice. "Sir Barristan," Robert said, "I charge you with their safety. If a hair on their heads is harmed, I will hold you to account, and there will be no mercy in the holding." "As your grace commands," Barristan said. Only a man who had given up his life's shape once could answer so without bitterness. "And you," Robert added, looking at Davos as if trying to recall where the sea had manufactured him. "You brought them safe. Name yourself." "Davos Seaworth, your grace." "A smuggler," Stannis said, before his brother could call the man honest and get himself trapped by his own mouth. "Now in my service." Robert's eyes narrowed as if at a jest he could not quite hear. "And my brother's service is mine," he concluded at last. "You'll be paid." "I did what was right," Davos said, because he did not know yet how to hold a king's coin in his mouth without tasting it. "The sea didn't want the babe." "The sea is a better judge than half the lords of the realm," Robert said. And there was something almost like gratitude in it, and something like weariness, and something like the man he had been when he ran across ridges and laughed after stags. They took the children up through the city in a slow procession because the city demanded it. The small folk leaned out of windows and tossed handfuls of grain like confetti, and then remembered that grain was food and stilled their hands. Some spat. Some wept. A woman with a yellow scarf held out a cradle charm on a string and cried out in a voice that had been rubbed raw by other crying, "For the babe, for luck!" Barristan took it because there was no law against luck. Varys collected looks the way other men collect taxes and spent them later. Jaime Lannister yawned and made a small court out of his boredom. Cersei watched the way the people's eyes slid over her to the basket and learned that a queen's hatred could be a second skin, and tried it on for fit. The Red Keep received them, as it received all kings and enemies of kings, with drafts that come from the wrong places, with floors that own the footsteps laid upon them, with sword points and perfumes. The skulls of dragons slept where they had always slept in the old vault below the throne room. Robert had ordered the torches lit there months ago, a private habit born of a public victory. The skulls were too large to fit human scale, and too small to fit memory. Their eye sockets held darkness like water in deep wells. He went down there alone late that night. The torches guttered because the drafts in that place obeyed no mason and no man. He drank wine that had lost its fire and kept its sweetness. He stood before the largest skull, the one the maesters had named Balerion, and he tried to remember what it had been to be 19, and sure the world would break itself for him. He tried to remember the exact weight and heft of Rhaegar's chest when he went down. He tried not to remember a bed in a tower, and the smell of blood and roses together. "Word," he said to the skull. The skull did not flinch. "Word, not guessed. The difference is only a chain," said a voice behind him, soft as wool to the touch and sharp as a hook where it met flesh. Robert did not turn at once. "If I hang chains on them, it will be for the realm to see, not for me to admire in torchlight. Come to gloat, spider?" "I come to serve," Varys said, and made a little shape with his hands as if to show how empty they were. "It is a hard thing your grace has done. The harder the thing, the more men pretend to praise it and wait for it to fail. Men. It will not fail if men do as they are told," Robert snapped. Then he laughed at himself because he had been telling men what to do for a year. And still they were men, not stones. "I have hung my mercy round my neck. Your friends across the water will know I did it." "Ah," Varys said, as if acknowledging the existence of a bird neither of them could see. "There are fewer friends than there were. A exile clings to the poetry of his wrongs until it clothes him as well as a cloak, your grace. Then he finds he cannot run, for the cloak trips him. The babe is a babe. The boy is proud and small. A man across the water cannot build a fleet out of pride and milk." "Nisan. Tywin will not like it," Robert said, and then smiled crookedly. "So I like it better. Lord Tywin's likes have set many tables," Varys murmured. "Dorne will approve. The Reach will weigh and find it as light as your grace's health, and as heavy as your grace's food stores. The North will shrug because it is the North. The Vale will call it justice, because the hand knows the word. Men are one day." "And the Queen?" Robert asked, finally turning. "The Queen will measure the space the children fill and decide how to move around it," Varys said. "She's a clever woman. Clever women make poorer enemies than fools, and better ones too." His smile was not unkind. "It would be well if your grace were to be a husband in the morning and a king in the afternoon, and not confuse the hours." Robert grunted and did not promise anything to anyone. Above them, the keep breathed its night breath, 1,000 servants making themselves into silence with the skill of long usage. In the nursery chamber, the babe that had been called Daenerys slept between 2 warm bricks and the prayer of a woman who had lost 3 children of her own. The charm the yellow-scarfed woman had pressed upon Barristan hung from the bed's corner, twirling slowly in the draught like a moon caught in a web. Viserys lay beside the hearth on a pallet, because he had refused a bed, and because Barristan had thought that refusal a kind of bravery he could leave intact. For now, the boy's fists were clenched even in sleep. He dreamed of a hall with black ribs and a table carved like a fire, and of a mother who did not speak because no one had told him yet that death could speak to the young as it does to the old, in other tongues. The court was not a place that kept mercy long without fingering it and measuring it for sale. In the morning, Pycelle's cough announced his thoughts before his words did. He believed in firm principle and firmer precedent, and he believed in the fat of his own comfort. Royal wards, he wheezed to the small council, must, of course, be placed where they can be. Molded. The Vale. "The Vale has my son," Robert snapped. "It will not have Viserys Targaryen. He will remain here, under my eye. The girl. She's a babe. She may do very well in the Vale, with the milksop heir and the old maids." "Ben?" "Your grace," Jon Arryn said mildly. "My maester is younger than Maester Pycelle, and my midwives have hands like carpenters. But if your grace believes the Red Keep is safest—" "I said what I meant." Robert's headache had come early and made itself at home. "What say you, Stannis?" "Law is law," Stannis said. He had slept little and looked as one hammered in a shape he had not chosen. "The king's word makes and unmakes. Viserys is to be watched, taught, kept from harm and from harm doing. If he disobeys, he is punished like any other boy. If he does worse than disobey, then the law—" He stopped, because the law had nothing to say about what a king would become when an old wound itched. "Then the law what?" Cersei asked. her voice sweetened with the honey that sticks to the knife's edge. She had chosen emeralds that morning. They sat on her like obedient lizards. "Forgive me. I am but a woman, and cannot follow such swift reason." "Then the law will be applied," Stannis said flatly. He did not look toward Jaime, who was smiling to himself as if a private song had pleased him. "See that the boy is put to Septim Mordain for letters and sums," Robert said, as if he were discussing hounds. "And to the Master-at-Arms for sword and stick." "Barristan." "I will oversee it, your grace," Barristan said, and did not quite bow because the white cloak bowed for him. "Let the girl be nursed by that woman we took from Driftmark," Jon Arryn said smoothly. "She has a good hand and no love of dragons beyond the milk she gives them. I will send a nurse from the Eyrie when the pass is clear." Menso. Cersei watched them parcel out the lives and felt a swift and almost pleasurable contempt, sharp enough to make music along her nerves. Men's mercy was a tapestry they never ceased embroidering with their own names in the borders. She thought of Maggie the Frog's old breath and older fingernails, of blood running in the palm and a laugh like a snapped reed. She stood and imagined cutting through the threads with one clean scissor stroke. And then she sat and imagined naming the scissor first. Later, when the day had presented all its falseness and taken none of his furies, Stannis went down to the yards where the Master-at-Arms made boys into men and men into cripples, and sometimes into knights. The wind off the city brought the smell of copper and dung and hot bread. In the far corner, under the shade of the wall, Ser Aron Sanagar was batting at a boy with a blunted yard sword, making the blade ring as if he were calling a small bell for supper. "Stop lifting your elbows as if you want the world to notice you," Sanagar said. "The world will notice you when your head is off, and it will not applaud. Keep them tucked. You are not a goose." He was a patient man who disguised his patience by making his voice impatient. The boy was Viserys. His hair was braided back like a small lord's, and he held the stick as if it were the one thing he had left that belonged to him. He was sweating, and he hated sweating, not least because it made him look like other boys. He gave Sanagar a look under his fringe, the look of a child who had not yet learned that death takes longer from some faces than from others. "Again," he said before Sanagar could order it. Stannis stood where the boy could not see him and watched him be brave in a ridiculous way. "It is a kind of courage," he admitted to himself, "to keep putting yourself against what will beat you." He found himself thinking, unbidden, of how Robert had looked when he touched the basket with 2 knuckles, and of how the kingdom had felt in his palm when he had passed it up a gangplank. Ser Barristan came to stand by him with the courtesy of a man approaching a wild dog he intended to befriend. "He has a quick eye," Barristan said. "It is faster than his strength. That can be corrected." "And his pride?" Stannis asked. Barristan smiled, a small private thing a boy might have trusted. "Pride makes a sword heavy, but pride can make a man take his practice when others sleep. The trick is to let it turn into discipline before it rots into resentment." "Do it," Stannis said. He did not know whether he had asked a favor or given an order. "See that he is watched at all hours, and that he thinks himself merely watched at some." "His sister will have old women and young," Barristan said, "and the queen's eyes and the hand's ears and the god's indifference. She will have what all royal babes have. There is nothing rarer than a child who must grow with men's plans balanced upon her." Stannis grunted. The yard rang. Viserys had tried to leap where he should have shifted. Sanagar rapped him on the calf, and the boy's pride leaked out of his mouth in a sound he despised himself for making. He stiffened and did not let tears fall. Because the old rule still held. You may bleed, you must not cry. Stannis watched the lesson take root, and felt a strange mixture of pity and impatience with it. All boys learn what pain buys. Most learn to spend it on folly. In the rookery, Jon Arryn wrote letters that would set the tone of the realm for a season, and sealed them with wax that would not be melted again without being seen. One to Winterfell, to Ned Stark, and it was written as to a friend. "Robert has chosen the harder road. I put my back to it. Come when you can. Your counsel has always cut straight." One to Highgarden, to Mace Tyrell, offering softness with the warning of a call to account under it. One to Casterly Rock, to Tywin Lannister, written with the care one uses for flint near tinder. The king's will, the safety of the realm, the expectation of good service. One to Sunspear, to Doran Martell, who would find in it an invitation to show his patience. If old wounds were to be salved, it would be in other ways than blood. He sat long over the last, because he was an honest man and knew what he was about, and because he could not help seeing faces in the pools of wax that were not the faces of men who would read. Ned Stark came by ship 2 weeks later, because winter winds had caught the roads in their tooth, and because the news was a net you could not walk through. He came without pomp and found himself caught in it all the same. The city had taken the new fact of the wards and worsened it into rumor. The sails he saw from the deck before they furled were a catalogue of names Ned had learned like prayers in the slow north. Red wine grapes, mandel green, a line-drawn trout compressed until it looked like a knife, the stag with a crown. The river made a voice of itself and told him nothing he did not already know about mud. He went straight to the king and found Robert in the yard with his cloak off, sleeves rolled, a hammer in his hands for old time's sake. The hammer was no joke, it was the same length as Ned's arm. The men around had smiles made of the iron filings that praise throws off. Robert saw Ned over their mouths and let the hammer drop with a thud that made the yardstones remember the trident and shake. "Old friend," Robert said, and in that moment he was young again and brave without calculation. And then he wrapped Ned Stark up as if the two of them were trees and spinning the rope around them would keep a forest from burning. "You've heard." "I have." Ned held him back and looked into his face, and saw there a map of all the ways grief can be made to serve a kingdom. "You did as Jon counseled." "I did what I could do, and still look the gods and Lyanna in the eye," Robert said. "You'll tell me I am wrong, if I am wrong. You always did." "I will tell you nothing you cannot bear," Ned said. "Where are they?" "In the castle," Robert said. "Where else does a king keep his wolves and his lambs?" Ned went to the nursery and found a babe like any other, save for a thread of silver hair that glinted when the fire breathed. He stood and looked down at her, and felt the world enlarge itself a very little to make room for her. He had children of his own now. So many, it seemed sometimes, that his name must be stretched to cover them. And so he was not susceptible to the particular magic of small fingers and new sleep. But he was susceptible to justice. He watched the rise and fall of her breath, and thought of what mercy costs and what it buys, and of how those sons must be kept by men who sleep badly. Viserys met him in a corridor where the light came in narrow as swords. The boy had learned to keep his chin up without tipping his nose. He performed a bow that had the shape of defiance in it, and said, "My Lord of Winterfell," as if he had invented courtesy and was not much impressed by it. "My prince," Ned said. He did not need to call him such, and so he did. The boy's eyes flickered. He looked more like a Targaryen when he did not try to look like one. "The master-at-arms says I raise my elbows. He says I go to my father's grave that way." "You had best stop then," Ned said. The boy looked as if he did not know whether to be angry or grateful. "The Queen hates me." "The Queen is a Lannister," Ned said, and let the boy take from that what he would. "They say my sister will be sent away," Viserys said, as if discussion of the baby's fate were something he had come to late and was determined to take up anyway. "She will be kept safe," Ned said. He thought of his own sisters and of the bones of promises. He thought of how the realms men build for children are often riddles they cannot solve. The boy stood and wanted to be told what to do. Ned had never been good with boys who were not his own. His kindness made itself into roughness in his hands. "Keep your elbows down," he said at last. "Do as you are told. Learn to read men the way you wish to learn to read swords. One will save your life more often than the other." "I will be king," the boy said, not loudly, but with the stubbornness of a child who has found one place in the world that does not move when pushed. "You will be alive," Ned said, and left him there with the light like swords. In the Queen's solar, the sun made 1,000 small golds out of the gold already there. Cersei sat among them as if she had been born at their center. She held a cup of watered wine she did not drink and spoke to her brother in low, precise tones that made a shape in the air. "He has done it to spite father," she said. "He will spend the winter doing things to spite father, and then he will find himself at table with father and the realm between them, as if it were a roast. Father will carve it. It is what he does. Bam. Dang. Jaime lounged in a chair too low for his long legs, and made a study of boredom. If he did it to spite father, I like him better for it. You like men better when they do things for reasons you can understand, Cersei said. I like swords better when they cut, Jaime answered. The boy will not matter for years. The girl will not matter for longer. If they matter at all, we will have had time to plant seeds. Why wrinkle your brow about winter wheat? You are content to wait, Cersei said. She lifted the cup finally and sipped at it, and the wine sat sourly on her tongue, because nothing could be sweet in a room that had been treated as a stage. I am not. The hand thinks he can tie the realm into knots that will hold when the king pulls. He cannot. The king will pull and forget he has a rope in his hand. Then let him pull, Jaime said, as if men were knots to be admired for their decorative complexity rather than cut. Down in the kitchens, the women who made the kingdom's food spoke of the children as women do, when they wish to practice politics without admitting it. She has teeth like any babe, said the nurse from Driftmark, proud and practical. She pees like any babe. The gods put their marks where they choose, and I have never seen one on a child's arse. She will be a beauty if she lives, said a scullery with a pink scar along her jaw from a kettle's affection. The silver hair. Men will be fools for it. Men are fools for anything if they want to be, said an older woman who had learned to keep her hands busy when her mouth worked. She was plucking a goose and looked at the feathers as if they had betrayed her. Beauty makes it easier, but beauty also makes them think they have a right to do worse. Men now. In that way, because a king had chosen, the world settled itself into a new pattern. The pattern would hold until it didn't, like any web. A careful eye could see where the spider had left extra threads against the day the fly grew larger than expected. The calendars in the septs were marked with days of Thanksgiving, touchy as cats. They changed the names of the days to suit the hands that paid for candles. But the prayers that went up were less pious and more practical. Let the city not starve. Let the river not flood. Let the king drink less. Let the boy be taught to hold a sword correctly and to put it down when told. Let the babe's teeth be even and her temper manageable. Let no lord see in these children the start of a banner. At dusk on the third day, Sir Barristan took Viserys to the yard alone and sent Sir Arryn off to instruct a round-faced squire whose father had bought him a sword and forgotten to buy him ears. He handed the boy a wooden blade that had been balanced as if for a grown man, and watched his wrists bend under its honesty. I will not coddle you, Barristan said. Your house did not coddle me when I fought for the wrong king. You fought for my father, Viserys said. I fought for the king I had sworn to, Barristan answered. I will teach you the only oath a sword knows. Keep your feet. Keep your breath. Keep your eyes on the thing that kills. I know what kills me, Viserys said, and cut his eyes past Barristan toward the tower where he thought the queen was watching, and found only stone. It sits a throne and smells of wine. Death smells of many things, Barristan said. Sometimes, when you are lucky, it smells of leather and sweat and sun-warmed grass, and comes in the afternoon when you are ready. He smiled, thinking of the Reach in his youth, a boy on a small horse with a spear too tall for him. Mostly it smells of your own fear. Shall we begin? They began. The wooden swords made a polite clicking in the yard, the kind of noise you could pretend not to hear through open windows. Stannis watched for a time, and then went to the wall to look out over the city that had been placed in his brother's hands, like a sleeping child with a fever. The sea beyond the river had put away the wildness of the weak storm, and gone back to its old work of pretending to be tamed by men's ships. He thought of a life measured by what he could make and what he could hold, and of a brother's life measured by who would love him for doing or not doing, and of how both measures fail in the end. He did not see Davos below at the river's edge, sitting with his feet on a bollard and his hands quiet for once. The smuggler had his pay as a pouch new weight, and he had his promise to keep to a wife he had half abandoned for the war, and he had the odd thought that the gods had arranged the world so that a man could carry a king's work on one shoulder and a child's basket on the other, and not know which had made him more himself. He looked at the water and did not try to read it. He had learned long ago that the sea tells the truth only to men it means to drown. That night, after the castle's breath had settled, and the day's mask had been hung up by the door, the babe awoke and made a small ordinary cry. The nurse took her up and put a breast to her mouth and sang a nonsense song in the old tongue of Driftmark, which had no power in any court and a great deal in kitchens and cradles. Through a trick of draughts, the song found its way along a corridor, and through a vent, and down a stair, and into the room where Robert slept sitting up, because lying down made the dream start sooner. He woke to the sound of it and could not place where he had heard it before. He thought, for a foolish moment, of a hunting song at Storm's End, of Morn's merry lads, and a stag that bounded exactly where it should for the story to go on making sense. Then he remembered he was king, and the song was for a child he had decided would live, and he lay back and let the sound climb a little way up the blank wall of sleep before it slid down again. He did not drink. He did not swear. He breathed as if his ribs had decided they might. In the morning he would shout at the council, and be soothed by Jon Arryn, and vexed by Stannis, and made amused by Renly. In the afternoon he would look at the boy, and think of the man he might become, and would imagine both one way and then another, and find that the realm looked different in each imagining. In the evening, he would hold the hunt in his head like a charm. But in the night, there was only the song. It made a kind of sense no law could write. Far to the south, in a water garden, where the air always remembered green, Doran Martell went very still when the messenger spoke the last sentence, and watched a child he loved run through a fountain's sheets, and try to catch water with her hands. He thought for a long time and did not speak. When he did, it was to a maester whose hands were too clean. "Send for my sister," he said. "We will receive this mercy, and we will watch it." In Casterly Rock, Tywin Lannister read Jon Arryn's letter, and put it down upon the table where he counted debts. His face did not change because his face was the careful work of years. If anyone had been there to see him in the moment after he set the letter down, they might have thought he had fallen asleep with his eyes open and his back perfectly straight. He had not. He was rearranging a shelf in his mind where he kept jars filled with future. He had labeled one ward now. He pulled a quill toward him and began a reply that said nothing but meant everything, and would be remembered by men who did not yet live. The realm inhaled, as if to test the fit of the breath in its chest. In the Red Keep, the boy learned not to lift his elbows. The White Knight built him muscles that would hold the weight of the future, or break under it. The babe learned that comfort comes in cycles if you insist, and that a woman singing in a tongue she will not teach you is as good a wall as any man can make. The king learned to sleep 3 hours at a stretch, and thought it a victory. The queen learned the way the light fell in rooms at different hours, and filed it with other weapons. The hand learned again the old labor of keeping an old friend from becoming his own ruin. The brother learned that stubbornness is only the skeleton of loyalty, and must be fleshed if it is to be a man. In the cellars, the skulls took no notice. In the city, men told one another that the king had taken dragons for wards, and the better sort spat, and the worse sort nodded, and the wisest sort shrugged, because they had seen kingdoms try many things. The sea did not change its mind about drowning the unready. The wind filled sails and tore them with the same carelessness as ever. And outside the walls of men the gods, if gods they were, faced each other as they had always done, with the blank courtesy of mountains. On the 5th day the boy came to Barristan with a cut lip he had not earned in the yard, and did not weep. Barristan said nothing, and taught him to turn his wrist under, so that a parry would not knock his own blade into his face again. On the 7th day, the babe began to smile, the way small creatures smile when digestion is merciful, and the world is warm. On the 10th day Robert hunted a boar outside the city walls, and returned with blood up to his elbows and joy in his voice, and a headache waiting in his cup. On the 12th day, Jon Arryn received a note tied with a braid of black and red silk. A polite letter from Illyrio Mopatis in Pentos, all compliments and condolences, grieving what had been lost and praising what had been preserved, offering spice and silver, and in a postscript, a remark about how quickly storms come and go. Jon Arryn smiled as if he had seen a game set and removed a piece quietly. The days made themselves into a pattern. Patterns, given time, become habits. Habits, given a kingdom, become history. In the history that had been written so far, kings burned cities and heirs were dashed against walls and sisters, and lovers died in towers, and men kept promises they could not speak aloud. In the history that was writing itself now, a king had decided to make two enemies into wards and call it mercy. Men who love neatness in their ledgers find such entries maddening. Men who live by songs find them disappointing. Men who live by mournings, however, find them beautiful enough to keep. When winter came down the mountains and sent its blunt fingers into the passes, Daenerys Targaryen would be old enough to pull herself up by the edge of a chest and shout her first, "No!" Viserys would be old enough to see that the way the world looked at him was a map he could follow, if he could learn to read it. Robert would be old enough to acknowledge that no man remains the age he was when he thought himself happiest. Jon Arryn would be old enough to feel the weight of the realm, not as a punishment, but as a book he would like to finish and cannot. Cersei would be old enough to set aside one set of dreams and pick up another. Stannis would be old enough to admit that the law without mercy is a blade without a hilt. For now there were only days, and a newborn's cry, and the slow work of telling a new story to a kingdom that had believed it knew how the old one ended. The Red Keep, which had seen worse mercy and better, took the weight and settled it against an old wall. The wall did not crack at once. Some things break slowly and leave no sound for years. Others bend and teach men the shape of bending until the shape seems like the truth. The rain came again and washed the dust from the cobbles, and the soot from the gargoyles' mouths, and the wine from the steps of the great hall. The smell of the city made itself new and old at once. Of it all, on the hill that is never quite steady underfoot, a king touched two knuckles to a cradle and tried to remember what promises mean when spoken aloud. He did not always succeed, but he kept touching and trying, and finding that each time the distance between the first and the second was less. Oh, Ka. Snow never quite reaches King's Landing even when winter puts its blunt fingers into every pass to the north and worries each river like an old dog with a bone. What comes instead is a salt-tinged cold that creeps under doors, a thin white breath from the black water each dawn, and a whitening at the edges of breath on the early watch. The long shadows along the inner yards make alleys into something like secrets, and the stones remember the old warmth with more longing than the men do. In that light, the Red Keep is less a castle than a patient with an old wound, doing its best. Viserys learned to run the yard wearing 2 shirts and a stubbornness that made mist around his mouth. His wrists thickened. The bruises he took from the blunted swords darkened, yellowed, and vanished the way small defeats do if you outrun them. Sir Aaron Santagar rapped his elbows with a polite, cruel stick, and when the boy no longer lifted them like a goose, ceased. Sir Barristan made him hold the wooden blade with his eyes closed until his hands knew it without help, and then made him walk the yard blind while the white cloak tapped at him from unexpected quarters. A soft rain that taught a boy which way gravity goes when you are afraid. "Keep your breath," Barristan said. "Breath is a rope you throw across a river. Each time you forget to breathe, the rope slackens." Then, Viserys tried to be stingy with every gift the world offered him because he expected every gift to be a rope back to humiliation. He hoarded his breath and then learned, slowly, what giving means when it is to yourself. When he fell, because boys always fall, and men too, he learned to put his hand down along the grain of the fall, not across it. When he bled, because sticks make mouths of skin, he learned to stare at the red and see it as a price, not a theft. Sometimes the king stood along the low wall near the fig tree and watched for a few moments, a man pretending he had merely happened by on his way to a laugh. Robert's face wore more winter these days, even with the cups kept in their place. He watched the boy's feet and thought that old rage is like a weight in a pack. When the climb steepens, you will wish you had thrown it away at the last lodge. Then some sound from the hall would call him away. The cough of Pycelle before council, or Jon Arryn's measured voice finding him with a question before the day made a wrong shape, and he would go, tugging at the too fine cuff of a too fine shirt, a stag that remembered he had been a huntsman. Daenerys grew in centimeters of light. She was carried from hearth to window and back again by the nurse from Driftmark, who did not believe in names for hours, and instead measured the day by the weight of the child in her arm. She had a habit of turning her face to a draught as if she could drink it. She took to the wooden charm on the bedpost and learned its twists with her fingers, as if that was a kind of reading. When she fussed, the nurse sang the old sea songs that live below language, smooth as worn stones, and the babe's expression would do that serious work peculiar to infants, listening like a judge. The queen had a way of not coming to the nursery that was louder than coming. Her women would appear with a gift in a silk wrap, an embroidery hoop with a sprig of golden barley stitched into silk, a rattle made of chased silver, set it down and leave with faces that said they had done a gentility, and could now go back to telling one another truths in low voices. Cersei herself came only once in those early months, with her hair caught in a net of pearls that made a small hiss when she moved her head. Like insects, she stood at the foot of the cradle and looked as if she were inspecting a ship that would never sail. "She sleeps," the nurse said, because there was nothing else it was safe to say. "And wakes," Cersei answered, as if correcting in arithmetic. Her smile for the women stood about her could have been hung on a wall and would not have changed its shape. For a moment she tilted her head, considering. "She will be pretty," she said at last. "Men forgive pretty girls more than they forgive their sons." Then she turned and went, and the pearls murmured their small dry comment on the way. Jon Arryn's letters ran like quiet rivers under the skin of the realm. Their wax broke in Winterfell, where Ned stood with a boy asleep on his shoulder, and read by firelight while the wind sang its lesson at the shutters. He wrote back with lines that were short and steady as the fences you set when you intend to keep sheep. He would come south once the roads reopened, or, if the hand should require him sooner, he would leave Catelyn to the north and bring a small guard across the mountains and down by sea. He did not tell his wife what was in his bones when he thought of the wards. Mercy is a northern word too, but in the north it is worn smooth and private by constant handling, not displayed. He kissed the sleeping boy's hair and smelled milk and smoke and something like grass because the boy had been in the yard on an unseasonable afternoon and had trampled a basket of rushes. The perfume of small accidents clings longer than incense. In Casterly Rock, where the ocean's hand beats the cliff face as a long penance for thinking it could climb, Lord Tywin read Jon's careful assurances and folded them away without creasing the meaning. There was a moment, after the letter left his fingers, when his face did not know what to do, as if it had been trained only in triumph and in blandness. Then he rang for a servant and dictated to a clerk a perfectly polite reply, offering to send to the capital a cask of the Rock's best dark wine, older than the war, and some velvet suitable for a cradle, threaded with gold. When the clerk had gone, he sat a very long time staring at nothing, as if he could reach into the air and arrange the future until it did not offend him by being new. Doran Martell wrote nothing. He had learned the uses of letters and of silence. He walked in the water gardens under the thin winter sun and listened to children scream at the cold, as if it were a game that needed their effort. When at last he spoke of the king's choice, it was to a baron who had arrived smelling of horse and hessian and a recent bed, his smile sharp enough to peel fruit. "It is not a kindness to us," Doran said. "It is a kindness to himself. That is stronger. We will accept it. We will wait. There will be another time for other answers." And if the time does not come? Oberyn asked, because asking was his way of keeping promises from ossifying. He pulled a fig from a basket and peeled it with his thumb. The juice ran down his hand like a thin knife. "If the North learns to call mercy by a southern name, and the king learns to like the taste of peace, then the dead remain dead," Doran said softly, "and we have spent our rage on air. Either way, let the children play." Benbow. On a raw morning that spat a little rain but thought better of it, Stannis called for Davos Seaworth in a room that had all the plainness a lord can afford. The walls were bare of trophies. The hearth burned with thrift. A table at the window held the charts of the harbors of Blackwater Bay, the sweep to Duskendale, the teeth of Driftmark, the ugly riddle that was the Stepstones. Davos stood at the threshold with his cap in his hands and weighed the shape of the day. "You brought onions to Storm's End when there was nothing left but leather," Stannis said without preface. His voice had that rasp to it that men get when they have spent too long biting down on their own anger to keep it from arguing with their honor. "You broke a siege with smuggler's craft. You brought me the queen and the babe through a storm that had decided otherwise. A man who has done such service to his lord is made a knight." Davos blinked. The word felt like a fish placed in his hands. Sleek, valuable, and too alive for comfort. "My lord," he began, "because there are 100 ways to refuse grace, and none of them do not insult the man offering it." Stannis stepped forward into the refusal and cut it in half. "You will be Davos Seaworth no longer," he said. "You will be Sir Davos, and you will sit among my captains as a man whose counsel is heard, and to whom men must answer if they do not. This is the reward. Now for the justice." On the table lay a small cloth-wrapped packet. Stannis took it up and opened it with careful hands. Within, the knife gleamed the way a narrow principle does when you have polished it too often. "I told you what the law would demand if ever you were taken," he said. "It was not taken, but given. I am not a king. I am bound as I bind others. I will take a joint from each finger of your left hand, and afterward I will lay a knighthood across them. You will remember both the price and the grace." Davos swallowed. He had carried fear all the way through war, and never put it down. He had taught his children the difference between a wave that will play with you and a wave that has made up its mind about your lungs. He had never wanted anything as much as he wanted now, not to be less to his sons. He said at last. "Do it." Stannis did it himself because he had earned the right to be hated without delegation. He made it quick, and a man from the kitchens had a brazier ready, and the other man the vinegar and bandage, and the third man the bowl. There were prayers in 3 different tongues in the room, and none of them were spoken aloud. The gods hear as they please. When it was done, Davos bit through a strip of leather, and breathed like a man who has been thrust up through ice into air, and cannot believe in such charity. Stannis wrapped the hand himself. Then he put his own sword on Davos' shoulder, and spoke the words that men say when they wish to remind the world that honor can be hammered into shape. "Rise, Sir Davos," he said. "You will go to sea when I say, and you will come back when I say, and you will tell me the truth when I do not want to hear it. That is more than I have asked of any other knight I've made, because I have made few and will make fewer." Davos rose, less of a hand than he had walked in with and more of a man, and bowed his head before a lord who believed law and gratitude to be 2 scales that must be kept in balance with a care no other could be trusted with. He went down to the river to let the wind talk to the bandages, and found, unexpectedly, that the gulls could be companions and not merely thieves. The city learned, as cities do, by osmosis. A smuggler knighted and maimed, Targaryen children on the hill, the king who had broken dragons now holding one in a cradle with 2 knuckles. These things made a broth in the mouths of bakers and beggars and merchants alike. They flavored the small talk of seamstresses who hated the smell of wax but liked the pay, and of boys who ran errands for men who forgot they had once been boys. When the butchers cursed, their curses had new names in them, and the names were not all curses. The city took the news into its joints and moved around it. On a day when the sea decided to put on a blue face long enough to fool sailors into optimism, Robert decided to hunt. Jon Arryn set his jaw because hunting meant drink, and drink meant explanations and apologies, and more often than not, the work of weaving a web out of twigs and calling it law. But the king had not ridden beyond the city in too long, and the stag in him needed to feel the thud of hooves under him the way other men need to hear music. "Take the boy," Jon said quietly as the grooms brought up the horses. "Not to make a point, to make a memory." "Ma'am?" So Robert said in a voice he hoped was casual, "Come, lad. We'll see if the trees out there are any different than the ones your ancestors burned." He winced a heartbeat later, because the jest was poor. and the boy did not laugh. Viserys came in a plain brown cloak that did not say prince or ward, and a face that tried. He had not been beyond the walls since the day he came upriver with the basket in Davos' hands. The air outside the city had a space in it that he had not remembered air could have. The king's destrier looked back at Viserys with calm large eyes, and Viserys looked back as if at an uncle who might be kind if asked correctly. He mounted with more competence than grace, and bit down on a plan to show neither fear nor delight. The boar they raised in the thorn thickets was young and foolish, and ran faster than his mother, which is a sentence written in hooves. Robert laughed for the first time all week and gave chase. The boy hung on and did not fall. That was all the triumph he had asked the gods for that morning. When the boar vanished into brush too thick for a charging king and a ward who did not know his limits, Robert reined in and let the horse stand blowing, and slapped the boy's arm with the back of a gauntlet. "You stayed up," he said, like a man granting brevet rank. "Good." Viserys flushed because praise is worse than insult if you are starved of it. It makes your throat learn a new way. "Your horse is better than mine," he said, because something must be said, and because he had the peculiar little courage to say the awkward truth. "My horse is a damned prince," Robert agreed. And for a moment, their laughter met in the cool air, the way two streams cross. They ate bread and ham on a log. The ham was oversalted, and the bread under, and both tasted better than any roast in the great hall, because there was a smell of pine in the air, and a speckled dog trying to look dignified, while its eyes begged for a crust. Robert threw the dog a bone and watched Viserys watch him. The boy had a face that would grow handsomer if it could learn to forgive the world for not being impressed. "You know," Robert said at last, "because thoughts fester if left in a man like him. Your brother was a better man than your father." Viserys went still. He looked down at his own boot, as if he might find a shield there. "Everyone says so," he said. "They say it here as if they have always said it." "I say it because I hit him," Robert said. "You find the truth about men when you hit them." Rhaegar fought like a man who knew what he fought for. "Your father—" He stopped. He had intended to tell a boy a father's faults, and found he could not without making himself worse. "Aerys was ill," he said instead. "Illness takes people away without moving their feet. It took him a long way. I am glad I never met you then. I would have killed you too. That is a truth. I cannot make myself other than I was." Viserys kept his face still with the effort of a child, lifting a real sword. "Then why?" "Because I promised," Robert said roughly. "Because Jon Arryn knows more about keeping a kingdom than I know about keeping my temper. Because I looked at your sister and saw not a dragon, but a child. Because a man grows tired of his own ghosts and seeks ghosts he can live with." He broke off a piece of bread and tossed it to the dog and scowled at his own generosity. "Because sometimes mercy is lazier than killing, and sometimes it is harder. I chose the one that lets me sleep longer and wakes me more often." Viserys heard the places where the king did not know the shape of his truth, and filed them away, because filing things away is one way to be a prince when you have no crown. He stood and brushed crumbs from his cloak and looked out between the trees toward the smoke where the city breathed. "I will not thank you," he said, which was brave as dragon talk goes. "Not now." "You'll do as you please," Robert said, because he was king and did not have to be right in the moment. "Keep your elbows tight and your eyes open. That's all the thanks I need." When they returned, the queen waited in a shade of green chosen, because it made her eyes look like a promise you will regret believing. She took in the burrs on Viserys' cloak, and the way his hair had tried and failed to hold its order, and the happiness on Robert's face, and her mouth changed shape without moving. She kept the new shape. Varys padded along that evening with information like a cat with a mouse it intended to release and catch again. He found Viserys sitting on the stone lip of a fountain that had not been mended last summer, because men had been busy building scaffolds for a king's wedding, and for a sept's repairs, and for the new buildings that spring up around power like mushrooms after a wet night. The boy looked at the water as if it might become a map if stared at properly. "Your Grace," Varys murmured, "because names are knives if you know how to use them." "A moment. I am not a grace," Viserys said, without looking up. You are what men call you when they wish to remind themselves what story they are in, Varys said. What I wish to remind you is that stories change when told by men with pens. Frustrating, I know. But sometimes useful. Never forget that a word can be a seed. Planted correctly, watered judiciously. I am not a pot of parsley, Viserys snapped. Varys smiled, which is to say his face discovered the expression it had been practicing, and wore it well. You are a boy who learns, he said. And boys who learn become men who decide. I have seen many princes. I have seen fewer kings. Kings are not born alone. They are made by confidences and by silences. If you wish to live long enough to choose which, say little and ask much. I am not your spy, Viserys said. No one is, until it amuses them to be, Varys answered, and left the boy there to watch water coming out of a stone mouth that had never spoken. That winter small matters took on the shape of great ones because men needed practice. A petty lord from Crackclaw Point sent hawks with bells of tin because a cousin's son had come home from the war shy of one hand and was still the pride of the house. A ship out of Tyrosh put in with dyed silks that looked like a riot recently calmed. They tortured the women's eyes and made them feel their blood. A brawl in Flea Bottom between two sausage makers over whose offal was honest left one man with a broken jaw and another with a broken heart, because the watch took his daughter to a sept to keep her out of it, and the girl decided she liked singing and refused to come home. The city learns the taste of its rulers by these things. When the watch did not take bribes for a week, men told one another the hand had threatened to cut off fingers, and the tale was believed because everyone had heard about the Onion Knight's hand. When the watch went back to taking bribes in the second week, men said Stannis had been out to sea, and that explains it. Jon Arryn saw a different set of small matters and made quiet work of them. He sent word to the Vale to take in 36 orphans of the war. Children of men killed at the Trident or at the Green Fork later, or simply lost in the Saxon skirmishes whose names would never be recorded. He asked the Citadel for a young maester, for the nursery who had hands like a farmer and eyes like a librarian. The Citadel sent a bookish boy with ears that turned red when he was nervous, which was often, and a competence that made women smile without unkindness at the thought of him. He asked the Guild of Alchemists to check their stocks of wildfire, and took a private inventory of his own terrors. He also introduced to the council a small man from the Vale, with a cat's smile and a genius for subtraction. Petyr Baelish had healed from a duel long since enough to forget to be grateful, and had spent the time learning to turn hurt into coin. He bowed extravagantly and looked at Jon Arryn with eyes that were brighter than necessity, and made men forgive him for having come empty-handed. Master of coin, Robert repeated, when Jon first said the words in a room without Lannisters in it. He looked at Petyr and saw a boy with a beard attempting to look like a lord. He's a stripling. He makes strips into garments, Jon said. We need garments. The wedding drained the coffers, and the rebuilding of the city, after the sack keeps draining them. I would have a man who knows how to make debts work, as if they were servants rather than wolves. Petyr smiled. I can teach debts to heal, he said cheerfully. And to sit, not to roll over. That would make them dull. Robert grunted, then laughed despite himself. He missed Lyanna most when faced with men who made easy talk into difficult feeling. Fine, he said. But if I find one golden dragon gnawed, I shall set my own hounds on you. I shall teach the hounds to account for their meals, Petyr said. And bowed again, so low that the new knife tucked in his boot said hello to the stones. Petyr was polite to Varys in the way the sea is polite to the shore, acknowledging its existence while calculating new ways to rearrange it. Varys was polite to Petyr in the way the sky is polite to the sea, changing color in public, moving whole in private. Between them the realm learned that quiet men who do not sweat can make more noise than trumpets if given a ledger each. On a day when the city's breath smoked, even at noon, and ravens came late to the rookery as if their wings had been delayed by thought, Renly took it into his head to visit the nursery. He had the gift of being liked and the curse of knowing it too well. He ducked under a lintel with too much grace for a boy his age, and held out his hands as if he expected any child to leap into them. The nurse from Driftmark set Daenerys in his arms, with the careful air of a priest presenting a relic to a pilgrim. Renly held the small warm bundle and made his mouth silly, because that is what men do when they discover their own tenderness and wish to deny it. The babe seized the fine lace at his sleeve, and fed it into her mouth, and gummed at it with satisfaction. "She likes me," Renly announced. "She likes everything," the nurse said dryly. "It is the trick of being alive. You unlearn it in time." Renly took that like a bruise from Santagar. He smiled and put it where he could use it. "I will be the uncle to every child in this castle," he said. "I am very good at it." The nurse made a face that suggested she had seen many claims made by boys with fine hair and untested hands, and that this one would be neither the worst nor the best. Renly stayed long enough to be bitten gently, and departed with his lace damp, and his heart changed a degree he would not notice until years later, when the memory of a silver-haired girl's soft suck would make him imagine for a moment a world he had not chosen. Time unrolled its ordinary banners. A cockatrice was found painted on a wall in Spicer's Alley, and someone went around in the dark night and painted over it with a crude stag. Pycelle coughed and shuffled, and warned of the cost of everything while finding none of it burdensome when it landed against his own comfort. Jaime Lannister talked with the men of the City Watch, taught one of them a trick with a dagger that one day would be used for a purpose Jaime would never imagine, and laughed at small jokes and large. Cersei spoke a sentence to a northern man's wife that made the woman cry, and told herself afterward that it was because the woman was weak, not because Cersei was strong. Stannis sat with the harbor charts and fastened the fleet's masts to his mind until storms could not move them. Varys sent a boy with hair the color of stale straw to Pentos with a letter that said nothing and would be read in 3 ways by 3 men, and all the readings would be wrong and useful. And then, one late afternoon, as wind came scouring up from the east and made the pennants complain and the guards draw their cloaks tighter, Jon Arryn raised a question at the small council that made the room's warmth step aside. "We must speak of betrothals," he said. He put his hands on the table one atop the other, as if to keep them from going to his face. Not to decide every fate, not to make the realm a chessboard. To set markers. To tell those who wait that there will be a tomorrow and that they may plan for it. Robert made a sound. "Curses. I knew this was coming. Whom do you intend to marry me to next? A cask of wine?" She would be gentler. "Then now?" "Your Grace is married," Jon said. His voice was gentle, and his eyes were not. "I mean the children. All the children." Pycelle wheezed his eagerness. "A wise thought, my Lord Hand." "A wise? Name one wise thing you have ever thought," Stannis said without heat, as if reading a list of stores to be replenished. Pycelle colored, making his face look like a bad roast. "The wards," Jon said. He looked around the table, letting each man find himself in the word. "Daenerys is an infant. A promise set now could quiet certain speculations." And Cersei sat very still, like a poised needle. "You mean to bind Targaryen blood to the throne?" she asked. Her voice was calm enough to be weighed. Jon did not blink. "I mean to bind the realm to itself in as many places as will take a knot," he said. "If men know that we have planned for the days after tomorrow, they will be less eager to bring tomorrow down upon our heads. A betrothal is less than a marriage and more than a rumor." "To whom?" Robert asked. He was suddenly weary of the room's smell. Wax, ink, old stone? He wanted to be outside where anger has air to dissipate into. "I have a son in the cradle yet." Cersei's eyes did not flicker toward the nursery. "He is the king's heir." She said, "He must be free to marry where advantage demands when the time comes." Jon's mouth tightened the merest fraction. "Advantage is not one thing," he said. "There's the advantage of peace. There's the advantage of allies who have been reminded that they are bound. There's the advantage of reminding the lords that the king's mercy was not a moment, but a policy." "Then?" "Plainly," Petyr Baelish said brightly, The obvious candidate is the Queen's son. If you wish to present the King's mercy as policy, bind the symbol to the heir. It will make Dorne call off the dogs and make the Reach run its fingers over maps again. It will set Lord Tywin to counting, and when he counts, other men do not draw swords." Cersei turned her face toward him a fraction, as if acknowledging the existence of a new coin. "And cut my son's entitlement with a dragon girl's blood," she said. "No. Entitlement," Stannis said. He was looking at the map painted on the table, at the brushstroke that had made the trident look docile. "The boy is the King's son. That is his entitlement. The girl is—" He stopped, because he had no word that could be spoken aloud. "She is a babe who will one day be a woman," Varys offered, reassuringly. "And women do much of the making of kingdoms without any of the credit, which is why men forget that they do it until the crown slips on their heads." His hands fluttered. A dove might have escaped if there had been a real dove involved. A betrothal would be a show. The realm likes shows. Robert rubbed his face with both hands. He felt the stubble rasp and thought for no reason at all of a boy under a table on Dragonstone, and of the smell of blood and hemp rope, and of a basket. "Not now," he said finally. "You will have your betrothals, Jon. Gods help me, you always have your way. But not now. Let the girl cut teeth before you put a ring in her mouth. She will not be sent to Casterly Rock. She will not be sent to the Vale until late spring, and she will not be promised across a table where there is wine. The realm will be told that mercy is policy by what we do, and not by what we promise to do years hence." He glared at Cersei preemptively because it saved time later. "And you will not hiss over it like a cat in a dairy." Cersei's smile was a fine instrument. "I have never hissed," she said. "I observe." They left the question in the air, which is the worst place for a question because the air leaks politics into it. Pettier made a point of having a certain message whispered in a certain alley, and then told Jon Arryn very earnestly he had not. Varys had a quiet word with the septon of a small sept off Cobbler's Square, and in 3 days' time a sermon was heard in which the gods were said to favor binding the sins of fathers to the virtues of children, which satisfied no one and gave everyone a new line to quote. Winter pressed closer. The cold in the mornings had an edge to it that made boys yelp when they first took their practice swords. Santagar made them hold the wood tighter until the sting passed. Viserys began to beat older boys at the bout with short sticks that taught the truth of distance, and once he beat a boy he feared in secret and had to walk the walls alone for a night, because victory tastes of iron if you have swallowed too much humiliation. He made privately and without advice a decision that the skulls below the castle would not be gods to him. He would go to them, he would look, and he would not pray. He went at dusk and lit a torch himself because he disliked the way torches struck by other men burn with other men's intentions. The skulls received him as they receive everyone, with a silence that is older than judgment. He stood before the largest and tried to imagine the meat that had once hung to that architecture. He tried to imagine fire making a sound like cloth tearing. He tried to imagine a world in which fear of such a beast had made men bow, and then tried to imagine a world in which such fear had been replaced by fear of a man with a hammer and a crown. There was a sour comfort in it he did not wish to acknowledge. "You will not get answers from them," said a voice behind him. Ser Barristan stepped out of the torchlight slowly, the way a white bird folds itself into the dusk. They remember less than men do, and men remember mostly what makes their dinner taste better. "What did you remember?" Viserys asked, not turning. "When you changed cloaks? That oaths are heavier than gold when you have to carry them uphill," Barristan said. "And that when you have done your duty, and there is still blood, you must find a way to live with that fact. I am old enough to have carried both kinds of truth. You are young enough to choose how to carry them when they come. It is a better thing than men want to admit." "I was under a table," Viserys said. "And my mother was dying." "Yes," Barristan said, "because a boy's pain does not need to be made pretty to be acknowledged. And now you are here. The world does not pay restitution. It offers employment. Train, learn, decide what your name will mean besides a skull in a cellar." Viserys turned, and the torchlight made odd shapes of his silver hair and his earnestness. "Do you ever think about him?" he asked. "About Rhaegar. All men who rode at the Trident think of him," Barristan said. "Men who loved him find him in their dreams. Men who feared him find him in their children. Men who killed him find him in the river sometimes, if they look too long. He was what he was. He believed in songs more than in sums. In the end, sums win, until they don't." He glanced at the skull. "Those win sometimes too." They went back up the long stairs together, the boy thinking himself alone, and being wrong in a way that bodes well for men. When spring uncurled its reluctant green at last, the babe was carried into the outer garden and held finger-tight to the world by a woman with forearms like chair legs and patience, enough for 2 infants. She looked up at clouds and announced the weather to them, as if they perhaps had not noticed themselves. "You will be rain by morning, and you had best be clean when you come." Daenerys laughed at a bee, and the bee sat a moment on her small wrist as if stunned by being found dear. The nurse flicked it away with a thumb trained by 3 decades of not killing small things if she didn't have to. Lord Eddard came down from the north with a guard of men dressed in plain wool that had nonetheless been brushed until it looked like respectability. He had a second son now, a baby with a brown shock of hair who slept through the 1,000 small noises of a ship, and so had to be poked occasionally to prove himself alive. He kissed the king, embraced the hand, bowed to the queen with a courtesy that was not servility, and stood at the bed where Daenerys gurgled and tugged at a string, and looked with a face that had learned how not to speak out of turn. "She lives," he said, as if it were a report. "She does," Robert replied. His voice had a rough pride in it that made the queen's mouth tighten a hair's breadth. The boys learned to keep his elbows tight. Ned looked at visories in the yard and saw in him the particular rankness of adolescence, strength arriving faster than judgment. "He will live too then," Ned said. Jon Arryn brought Eddard through the city in the late afternoon and showed him a map of the realm that was not made of parchment. The faces. The men who had taken offices out of ambition and discovered in them duty. The men who had taken offices out of duty and discovered in them ambition. The women who did work without being seen and who saw everything. The boys who ran and the boys who listened. The girls who learned to count because someday their counting would stand between a street and a riot. "This is the kingdom," Jon said. "Not the skulls, nor the hammer, nor the throne. This." "Then you will die of it," Ned said, practical as winter. "And we will have to do it again." "That is what kingdoms are," Jon answered, and smiled because he knew the answer and did not expect it to comfort him. They spoke also, in rooms with shutters latched and names left unspoken, of what might make mercy something more than a tale told to justify a harder choice. "If we bind the girl into the realm by more than the name of ward," Jon said, "we will make your enemies reckon twice before they draw knives in the dark. And if we bind her wrongly," Ned said, "we will make enemies of men who would have been our friends. Which is why we must choose our enemies also," Jon said, and Eddard laughed without much mirth. "Eh? The gods have a friend in you, old hawk, if they appreciate a man who relieves them of work." "Man? D." When Ned went north again, he carried with him a memory that would not stop tugging at his sleeve. The sight of Robert bending over a cradle. He told Catelyn that the king had learned to sleep a little, and that the city ate bread where last year it had eaten promises. And he told her nothing of Cersei's eyes or of the new nimbleness that had entered the council in the form of a small man with big ideas, because she had enough to carry in her own house, and because husbands choose which burdens to share, as if they were choosing furs in a market, and take pride in the wrong choices. Rumors are the second river in King's Landing, and they too seek the sea. One said that Illyrio Mopatis had offered 20 casks of saffron if the babe were sent to Pentos to be fostered by his household. Varys murmured that it was nonsense, and made a note to find out whether Illyrio had, in fact, 10 casks to spare. Another said that Balon Greyjoy had sent a raven with sharp words about the wards and sharper about the fleet. Stannis had not received it and would have burned it in any case. Another said that the queen had taken to visiting the dragon skulls to whisper to them. This one was false, but its opposite had truth. She avoided them painstakingly, as if the stones might report the shape of her face to someone she could not bribe. One afternoon in late spring, when the first warm rain fell without warning and made every street smell clean for an hour. Cersei had Pycelle summoned for a private audience. He came with his breath and his chains, and an eagerness to believe that influences the same thing as wisdom. "Tell me," she said, "if a king may alter a ward's status without the council's approval." Pycelle beamed. "The king may do whatever he wishes," he intoned, "provided he wishes what is wise." She did not move. "And if he wishes otherwise, then the hand will prevail upon him," Pycelle said. "And if both persist, the law remains the law, my queen. A royal ward is under the king's protection until such time as the king declares otherwise. If your grace is troubled, I am certain the hand—" "I am troubled that the hand is too well," Cersei said softly, "and that the king remembers promises, even ones he did not make. Leave me." He left, sweating into his beard because sometimes he understood her and wished to go back to not. When he was gone, she stood very still and counted to a number that meant something to her alone, and then began to make a list in her head of women in the city who owed her favors or liked to feel themselves allied to a queen, even when it cost them sleep. In the lower city, a child fell through a rotten stair and bruised his ribs badly enough that his mother took him to the sept for ointments. He sat on a stool and looked at the painted stars on the ceiling that someone had retouched only halfway across, and wondered if the world had an edge like that. The septon looked at him and thought, not for the first time, that piety is a muscle which must be exercised or it atrophies, and leaves men with gestures instead of devotions. He spoke that morning of mercy because the Queen's people had asked him to, and because he had decided that he believed it anyway. 3 men in the back row listened with different hungers. One would join the watch and keep bribes even when not expected to. One would go home and be kind to his wife for 3 days, and then forget until his son reminded him. One would say to his friends that the gods were for rich men and that he was for bread, and then later, in a tavern, he would keep a fight from spilling by the simple expedient of placing his broad hand on a boy's chest and keeping it there until the boy stopped trying to prove himself. The sermon had done its work. Summer came. It came late and in a temper, but it came. On Dragonstone, the gulls made a noise like drunken fiddles, and the sea tried on more blues than seamstresses own. Stannis walked the seawall and watched a Taroshi Karak experiment with futility against an adverse wind. He had word of pirates in the stepstones and of smugglers who were, as always, patriots when they spoke and merchants when they sailed. In King's Landing, the heat added new smells to the markets and took none away. Sandor Clegane arrived in the capital with his brother's shadow still long behind him, and made himself valuable to House Lannister by being direct where other men were polite. He watched Viserys in the yard once, and snorted quietly at the sight of Barristan tapping the boy from behind to make him feel his feet. A man who learns to look behind himself every 3 steps. Sandor remarked to Jaime with the private insolence of men who are useful, "We'll trip and call it caution, or he will live longer to trip again," Jaime said, amused without believing it mattered very much. "The boy has a stiff neck. The gods like to test those." "Ben?" On a day when clouds piled themselves like castle walls, and then laid down flat and let the sun walk over them, Jon Arryn suggested a tourney. "Small," he said, anticipating Robert's eyes lighting, "to mark the end of a first year in which the city has learned new habits. A day of shows and bread enough to matter." "The coffers," Pycelle began, "of course, are my concern," Petyr Baelish said with easy cheer. "I will make arrangements. The purse will be instructive rather than intoxicating." He smiled at Varys, and Varys smiled back. 2 knives nodding as they passed in a sheath. They held it in the shadow of the hill of Baelor, between the sept and the river, where the wind plays with pennons and the dust does not quite settle. The people came because people will always come to watch men hit one another for a prize, especially if there is bread. And some came because they wished to see the wards dressed in their places, and some because they were watching their own city with curiosity as if it were a dog that has learned a new trick, and might this once not bite. Robert sat under a striped canopy with a wreath of oak leaves on his hair as if he had forgotten the weight of a crown. Cersei sat beside him in a dress that made the summer admit someone could be cooler than it. And when she clapped, it was impossible to say whether she applauded the joust or the way she looked clapping. Jon Arryn looked like a man trying to remember the names of 3,000 people and succeeding. Stannis sat and counted the armor that would need mending afterward. Renly laughed with the ladies and made promises to the heir. Viserys sat as if on a saddle and watched the tilts with an analytics eye, asking to be told the names of the men who rode without spare expense in their gear. The Northmen who had ridden down, the Stormlanders who had sold a ring to make their horses better by one breath, the Dornishmen who had long spears and longer grudges and did not waste either. When Ser Jaime took the field in gilded armor that made the sun feel humble, the crowd made the sound it had been saving all afternoon. He unhorsed a peacock from the reach with an elegance that made even Stannis nod once. He saluted the queen and the king and the small silver-haired child who sat quiet between a nurse and a septa, not Mordain, who was far off in a northern hall, still unsure how she felt about the gods and girls. Daenerys reached out a hand as if to catch the shine and then clapped at nothing in particular, the way children applaud the world. Late in the day, a hedge knight no one recognized took the purse for the archery. Thin, brown, with an arm that did not shake. He bowed to the king, took his coin, and disappeared quietly into the same quiet he had emerged from. When the trolls went home, bruised, and the sellers of sweets counted their coin and complained anyway, the king leaned back and said, "That was good," and did not reach for wine at once. And Jon Arryn thought that sometimes the realm is saved by small, stupid happiness that gives men patience for large, serious work. After the Tourney men talked again of betrothals, because such talk breeds in the stalls of events like these. Tyrell men made noises about a reach made for Renly, and were met with a joke and a deflection. A quiet suggestion came from Riverrun concerning a match for a younger Tully girl with a man who had a name but no lands. It was set aside for later. Someone, emboldened by drink or by the peculiar courage of those who speak in tents and not in halls, murmured in Jon Arryn's hearing that the king might set his mercy in stone by promising his heir to the Targaryen babe. Jon's smile was the kind men assumed to be agreement because they prefer to be agreed with, and was in fact the smile he used when filing remarks away. That night, when the noise had run out of the city like water from a bath, Robert went down alone into the skull room again. The torches hissed, and the air felt like something that wishes to continue being stone forever. He did not speak. He stood, a man listening to the lowest note he can bear. He thought of Rhaegar, and of Lyanna, and of a boy who had not thanked him. He thought of Daenerys asleep, and of Cersei awake, and of a realm balanced between pettiness and grandeur, like a cup on a table that is not quite level. He thought, without calling it by its name, of the possibility that mercy might not only be a sop to his own ghosts, but a weapon once sharpened. On another night, the queen walked the lower halls that smell of mortar and damp to a certain small door where a sworn sword with half an ear stood because she had seen to it. Inside, a woman waited with a ledger open. They spoke of bakeries, of the price of flour when ships did not come in on time, of which houses had too much of it to sell at a price that would not cause poor men to become dangerous. Cersei put a finger on one line and said, "This one," and the woman nodded and made a mark. It is a mistake to believe that the great do not understand a lever called want. Cersei had learned a thing she believed to be a secret, that sometimes the shortest road to making men kneel is to allow them to stand briefly with enough to eat, and then see who they thank. If the city thanked the king very well, it would have learned to think of gratitude that could be collected later. In Pentos, a man with perfumed sleeves sat before a plate of too much and too many, and told a magister with eyebrows like small cats that the Westerosi king had developed a taste for magnanimity. "There is no coin in magnanimity," Illyrio Mopatis said. "It is well for poets, and for men who already have a full table. But coin." He spread his hands, and the rings tried to make a sound, and couldn't. Without exile there is no market for tales. Without threat, there is no premium for ships with fast hulls. We will sell them saffron, and remember that children sometimes die in their sleep. His smile made Bread feel ashamed of being so honest. Years turn, and they do not. A late storm came in summer, as if it had lost its way on the road north and needed to ask directions. It broke masts, flooded cellars, and wrecked the fine new awnings over a tailor's shop in the Street of Silk. Men cursed and then admired the way the water went away, as if embarrassed by the trouble. In the keep, the skull room dripped for a week afterward and smelled like old teeth. Viserys took bruises that could be traced with a finger like the lines on a map, and learned the hand-to-hand that makes any man dangerous if he can look at another without blinking. Sir Barristan's praise came rarely and lay well when it came. Sanagar grinned at him once in the yard and said, "Now you look as if you might keep your head on your neck long enough to use it," and Viserys did not smile, because pride is a muscle too and must be stretched without being torn. Daenerys learned to walk like a sailor on a deck that isn't sure whether it wants to be sky. She fell and did not cry, looked up at the world with indignation, and tried again. She babbled words that made no sense and then made some, and when she said, "No," the nurse laughed and said, "You will do," and whispered to the driftwood saints of her childhood that they should keep the girl from men who love too quickly. When the king came to the nursery, the babe held up 2 hands, and he made his hands into a bowl for her, and lifted and found that some weights you miss when they are not there. "Little thing," he said once, surprising himself. Little. He did not find a word he could keep, and so he did not say one. He stood with the child on his arm and looked out at the river, and the river pretended to understand. There was a wedding in White Harbor that sent men coming south again with news that Lord Manderley had feasted his people for 3 days and drunk himself into a state of prayerfulness. There was a sickness in Old Town that did not kill as many as it wanted to because the maesters remembered their own books. There was a skirmish on the Green Fork that men would later pretend had been a glorious victory because one of the dead had been inconvenient to someone important. The realm continued to be the realm, which is to say a collection of leaks, little fires, small feasts, and the odd miracle disguised as coincidence. On a day hot enough to make lords loosen their collars and soldiers pray for shade, Jon Arryn collapsed on a stair and was carried to his bed. The city stopped breathing. The queen's eyes moved and became still. Robert sat with his hands on his knees, gripping them as if they might run away and leave the rest of him. Ned Stark came at a gallop that bruised men's memories of him, and stood by the bed and looked at his friend and saw a man who had been built for patience facing, at last, an imposition he could not outwait. The maesters did all the things men do when they do not know what is wrong, and fear that the gods will notice their ignorance. Varys drifted like mist along corridors and came away with nothing because sometimes there is nothing. Cersei went down to the skulls and did not enter, but stood a very long time before the door until a guard looked at her and then wisely looked away. Jon lived. Or rather, he did not die that day. He opened his eyes after 3 and spoke sensibly, if slowly, and said to Robert, "Be king," which is perhaps the most difficult command to obey that has ever been spoken. He did not exactly get up. He returned by degrees to his work, as a man returns from a long journey with the wrong coat and makes do. For a season the hand went to bed before midnight and woke with his heart beating like a messenger at a door. In that season, Robert learned to begin councils with his voice low and his cup on the table until after the 5th matter. In that season, Cersei learned that death did not come when called, which is a lesson that has spoiled many plans. In that season, Ned Stark agreed to stay longer than he had meant to, and wrote to Catelyn that mercy, once chosen, requires tending like a fire on a cold night. Feed it and you may sleep. Starve it and you will wake to ice. When autumn tried on a crispness like a new shirt, the question Jon had put aside came back in a different form. Joffrey was too and loud. Daenerys was near too and silent when she wished to be. Which was often. The city had accepted that both were, for now, part of its weather. The lords wanted something to talk about that would make their wives' eyes light or their rivals grind their teeth. Betrothals are gossip's grain. Jon Arryn came to the king with the smallest possible suggestion that could do the largest possible work. "Not a betrothal," he said. "A fostering. The girl to the Eyrie at 3 toit. The boy remains here. The realm will see that you give your mercy to others to keep for you. The Vale will be reminded that it is more than a featherbed. We will choose the wet nurse from a family that will call the favor due for 3 generations and never be tiresome about it. 9. Robert stood at the window with his hands braced on the sill, and looked out at the city that had not asked to be beautiful, and was sometimes, in spite of itself. And the Queen will understand that the girl is safer there than here, Jon said, knowing that Cersei understood whatever suited her, and that safety isn't a word that can be weighed on a scale. Viserys is progressing. He is not loved by those he needs, but he is not hated by as many as once. Robert made a face. The boy will never thank me. No, Jon agreed. But your enemies may be forced to praise you. We will take what we can get. So they did it. They made the announcement in a hall hung with cloth of gold, because sometimes you must look like wealth to persuade men that you are rich in more than coin. Cersei stood and looked at the babe with a new attention, as if seeing in her a road that led away from a threat and toward an advantage. Renly smiled and whispered to a lady who would remember the line longer than he did. Petyr found himself enjoying the way the Queen's jaw did not quite relax, and wondered idly how much it would cost to keep it that way for a season. Varys made his hands into a shape that looked like applause, and was actually calculation. Ned looked at the girl and thought of winter roads and careful riders, and of the way the Vale holds children as if they were made precisely for its slopes. Stannis nodded once, as if the law had been given a pillow that did not insult its backbone. Viserys heard the news and felt something old and ugly rise in him with such speed that he had to put his hand against a wall. He thought himself ashamed and then recognized, with a clarity that hurt, that what he felt was not jealousy. He would not miss the child, but the specific rage of being passed over in a decision that had to do with him. He went down to the yard and took up the wooden sword and made Santagar and Barristan work to keep him from hurting himself with his own effort. When he had spent it, he sat with his back against the wall, and looked up at the strip of sky between roofs, and thought of a different strip of sky he remembered on Dragonstone, knife blue and hard above a tower window. And he allowed himself one small honest thing. He missed the sound of that sea. The Eyrie received Daenerys Targaryen without fuss, and made her into one more small person who must be protected from edges. Lysa Arryn took a liking to the girl because some women like children, in the way other women like lapdogs, and because the girl was quiet enough to let Lysa hear the conversations happening in her own head. Robin Arryn, small and sickly even before he was called by a different name, patted the girl with the seriousness of a boy, for whom small kindnesses are the only contests he can win. The high air made the child sleep as if she had been given an extra blanket. The nurses spoke of her hair and put oil on it, and argued whether its silver would darken as she grew. The older ones said no, because they liked the idea of a story in their nursery, and the younger said it might, because they liked the idea of seeing change and having something to remark upon in the evenings, when their hands hurt from fine work. Jon Arryn looked down from the moon door once at an afternoon so clear that distance ceased to exist, and said to no one, "This is what we do it for," and then thought that this is also what men throw away for noise, and for a moment's sense of having made the world obey. He went back to his papers and his messengers, and to teaching the king to read the kingdom as if it were a letter that might have been written by a man in a hurry. Back in King's Landing, the space left by the child's absence did not stay empty. Spaces never do. The queen felt the hallways larger and disliked it, so she filled them with women and with talk. Robert found one less reason to climb to the nursery, and so climbed less to anywhere, which made Jon Arryn climb more steps to bring matters to him. Viserys spent more time in the practice yard, more time in the library, and, surprisingly to himself, a little more time in the kitchens, where he discovered that butter has a sound when it meets a hot pan, and that the sound is civilizing in a way that looking at skulls is not. The cook, a woman with arms like tree limbs and wit like a skinner's knife, allowed him to stand out of the way provided he answered every question she put to him about the names of herbs and the weight of measures. He did so, and came away with a new respect for orders that can be eaten. Now and again, at a turn of corridor where drafts tell secrets, he and Cersei crossed paths. She had learned to look at him as if he were a page someone had left open in a book she had not meant to read. He had learned to meet her eyes with the quiet insolence of a boy who no longer expects to win and who has found a different game. Sometimes she said his name precisely, Viserys. Sometimes he said hers in the same tone, and a guard nearby would learn the color of fear that comes when two snakes seem to nod to each other. One evening she stopped when he did and said, without looking at him, "Your sister will grow up among mountains. She will find it makes her heart small or very strong." "And your son?" he asked. "What will make his heart?" She smiled. "His mother," she said. Then she was gone, and he stood there and disliked her for telling him something true. Years are ladders. You climb without looking down, and then you look down and discover you are higher than you meant to be. Viserys' wrists grew into his hands and his balance into his back. He stopped tripping on the edges of rugs. The men in the yard stopped smiling inwardly when he took a weapon. Barristan praised him twice in a month and told him a third time, without praise, a truth. "Your temper will kill you faster than any Lannister if you let it. Learn to spend it like coin, not fling it like offal." Then no. He learned. Not quickly. Not graciously. But he learned. He learned to stand still in taunts the way a good horse stands in thunder. He learned that certain men in the yard admired the boy who shouted, and more admired the boy who listened. He learned that Jaime Lannister's contempt was neither as important nor as harmful as he had believed, and that Jaime's flicker of respect, given once and never acknowledged, was worth more than a night's sleep. And then, as if the gods had grown bored with letting men make their slow mistakes, the Iron Islands burned. Word came like a rumor that had borrowed boots. Balon Greyjoy had declared himself king, had set his black sails to the wind, had remembered winter in a way that other men do not, and had found in it a crown. The ravens were sudden and everywhere. The king shouted with joy as he had not shouted in years. War cleans a man who has been waiting too long to strike something that will strike back. Jon Arryn sighed from the bottom of his ribs and began his work. Stannis put pins in a map with the concentration of a man writing a prayer. The queen had fear and relief on her face at once, because in war, there is purpose, and in purpose, there is a place to put your beauty to use. Ned Stark wrote from Winterfell that the North would have men ready and grain sent south, and that he would come if required, leaving Catelyn to keep the snow and the children from eating one another. Robert called the bannermen. The city turned to a kind of errand that makes ordinary men feel grand. Sharpening spearheads in the street, mending tack in doorways, shouting in cheerful voices at horses that did not care. Viserys stood on the outer wall and watched the armada to be. Ships gathered from Blackwater Bay, from Driftmark, from Massey's Hook, like a boy who had found a toy that would be his ruin or his making, and could not tell yet which. He felt, once, a desire to be aboard, to earn a scar that would let him announce himself to a world that had known him too long as a guest. And then he remembered a cradle and a decision, and thought of what it means to be allowed to live long enough to make a choice. He went to the yard and built a breath he could throw like a rope across water. Stannis took the fleet. Sir Davos stood on a forecastle, with a hand still telling the truth of old justice, and a new surcoat, and a heart he held very still, because hearts that beat too loud distract a man in battle. The king rode west with his hammer singing in its old voice and Renly at his elbow, because the boy needed dust on his boots that was not made by courtiers. Jon Arryn rode too, and men who loved him told him not to, and men who knew the realm told one another that the realm would not forgive him if he did not. Varys stayed, smiling and counting. Petyr smiled and spent and abused sums until they bowed to his will. Cersei stood on the wall and looked west, and imagined the color of foam when blood enters it. Viserys came to Barristan and said plainly, "Teach me what to do when men do not return." So Barristan did as much as anyone can teach that lesson. He taught the boy to write letters he did not want to write. He taught him to stand beside women who had grown quiet, and to say the right names in the right order. First the dead's given name, then the name by which he had been loved, then the deed by which he would be remembered, and to accept their hatred as the tax paid for wearing a surcoat in a city at war. He taught him to listen to a man with a broken leg teach him that he had not been brave, and to say that matters less than the fact that you went. He taught him to decant fear into usefulness. The war was not long. It was not simple, either. Men died on pike and on sea-slick planks, and priests sang to a drowned god that does not take bribes. The fleet burned in the right places and the wrong. A storm came and made a fool of a man who had thought himself too clever to build his sails stout. When it ended, Balin bent less than a king should. The king returned with victory, and with a soreness across his network connection lost. Attempting to reconnect.